We're gonna laugh a lot.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the host and the founder of the Rise Above Justice Movement, the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. All right, today I'll give a viewer discretion is advised due to the nature of the topics that we will be discussing. And it's going to be a very broad discussion, and we have a lot of time. So, this incredible human being reached out to me a little over a year ago. And yes, we've been trying to make this happen for over a year. I know it doesn't feel like it, but it has been a little over a year. I was looking back at the previous messages and the previous emails. It's been a little bit over a year, over approaching a year, I guess I should say. But Elicia, hey, look at that. I fucking got it. But I'm so excited to sit down and finally have the chance to talk to you about the incredible work that you do, teaching women self-defense. I'm not going to spill too much here because I want you to share it in your own words, but feel free to introduce yourself. And, the first question is, what's your story? And I know that there's a lot that goes into this. And this is the point where, the very beginning of the episode is where the typical rambling comes in, right? And it paints that whole picture, and then we'll kind of like dive into a little bit from your website, and then a lot of your branding, and we'll dive into that. But first things first, introduce yourself and tell us what your story involves and what it is.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Elicia Ybarra, and I am the owner and founder of prettyhandshardpunches, which is a women's self-defense program that I created and developed myself with the help of multiple masters and black belts across various forms of martial arts, including Taekwondo, Hapkido, and Jiu-Jitsu. I myself am a lifelong martial artist. I've been training for 31 years this year. I hold a fourth Dan black belt in Taekwondo and a first Dan black belt in Hapkido, and I have trained in almost every form that you could possibly think of in martial arts throughout my career. And one of the things that I faced at a very young age was I was abused by my martial arts instructor. So I started my martial arts career at 6 years old when I proudly told my dad I wanted to be a ninja, like my favorite Ninja Turtle Donatello. And my dad enrolled me into my first Taekwondo school. And from there, I became very obsessed and I got really into every aspect of martial arts that I could think of. And when I turned 13, I had earned my first black belt and I had truly outgrown the school that I was at. And I was ready to go into more competition-based schooling. And so I transferred to a new martial arts school. And that was where I met the instructor that would ultimately groom me. I was 13 years old. He was 21 when he started paying extra attention to me in the classes. And by the time I was 15, he had introduced me to my first real romantic relationship. He had given me my first real kiss. He was 23 years old when I was 15. And by the time I was 16, it had turned into a highly inappropriate sexual relationship. Nowadays, we openly say statutory rape. At that time, back in the early 2000s, that wasn't something that was really spoken about out loud. I was often blamed by the adults that were around me for the relationship with this instructor. I left that school at 16 years old, and the way that I left was very detrimental to my mental health. One of the things that the instructor said to me that really solidified the feeling of guilt and shame was that I had tempted, I had seduced him, and that now I was trying to ruin his family, his life, and his career by speaking out. The very verbatim words he said to me was that nobody was going to believe me, and that if I told anyone what had happened between him and I, that he would ruin my career in the martial arts industry because no grown man was going to believe a teenager who made up stories about her instructor. And so I walked away from that feeling all of the internal accountability, blame, shame, and guilt that victims also often feel when faced in a grooming situation. And I didn't understand that for years. But I did not let that stop me from my ultimate career goal of opening my own martial arts school. So at 18 years old, I took a job teaching martial arts professionally down in Southern California. I got the job on merit. The Grandmaster had seen me and basically headhunted me and said, "Hey, I want to hire you down here." And I was super ecstatic at 18 years old, 2 weeks after graduating high school. I packed up my 1994 Suzuki Sidekick. I had named Flipper because if you take a corner over 25, you're going to flipper. And I drove all the way down the 6 hours from my hometown to Southern California to complete my dream of being a professional martial arts instructor. And from there, I met the boss's son, the grandmaster's son. And instead of being an instructor, I became the boss's son's girlfriend. And I spent the next 3 years in a highly controlled, abusive, cult-like environment where the grandmaster, because I was engaged to his son, controlled every aspect of my life. And when I couldn't do what he wanted me to do, and I couldn't be the silent, submissive, quiet, instructor that they wanted, I started to face abuse even more. When I stood up for myself, my boyfriend broke up with me, not in a traditional, hey, I want to break up. He actually had his mommy break up with me at the local Denny's for him. That night, I was dumped, fired, and I was sent home. And from there, about 3 months later, I was brought back by the grandmaster because his son decided he wanted me back. The abuse got worse. And it was one of those times where I didn't understand what cult-like environments were, but I knew something wasn't right, and I didn't trust my gut enough to understand that I needed to get out of the situation. So instead, I tried to make it work. I tried to change who I was, the very being of myself, in order to be what this grandmaster wanted, in the hopes of making my dreams of owning my own martial arts school come true. And that did not work, and it did not happen when I found out that my co-instructor was making $6 more an hour than I was, even though I outranked him and I had more than a decade of more experience than he did. But he looked the part of a head instructor and I didn't. So he made the title, the pay, and the headline essentially of being a head instructor, and I was required to do all of the work behind the scenes. At that moment is when the bubble truly burst. You know, we always talk about how there's a switch, there's that light switch moment of all of this is bullshit. That was my moment. I realized that in that 3 years, I was not being trained to complete my own goals of owning my own martial arts school. I was being trained to be the wife of a school owner, to silently, submissively, and humbly support my husband in his family goals. And it was in that moment that I realized everything had been a lie. All of the abuse I had endured under the guise of making me stronger to own my own school, under the guise of mentorship, under the guise of leadership, all of the humiliation I had endured was all at the hands of this grandmaster because he was trying to break me down to be submissive to his son so that I would be the right type of wife. That did not go well. I ended up leaving, getting fired and blackballed and all kinds of bad shit. And it really spiraled me to a depression. And this all happened 2 weeks before I turned 21 years old. So, like many 21-year-olds that don't make great decisions with their life, I went home to my hometown and I started to party. That night, I shotgunned my first beer, bought a pack of cigarettes, and got a tattoo on a mission to forget the abuse and the trauma I had endured, not even understanding that it was trauma. I then spent the next year trying to party the pain away. I had officially gone from karate girl to party girl. I had gone from respected martial arts instructor to just that one random party girl that was taking too many shots. And I didn't quite understand what was happening, but that was when I met the most abusive man that I would ever meet in my lifetime. And he swept me right off my feet, like many trained and skilled abusers do. He knew all the right things to say to me in order to get me isolated and under his thumb. And the moment that he had me, and he truly had me. He had me dependent on him for my financial stability. He had me dependent on him for my worth and my value. And I looked to him to set my boundaries for me, was when he physically started to get abusive. I spent 18 months in a physically toxic and abusive relationship where he sexually assaulted me, strangled me, beat me, hit me, kicked me, all of the physical type of abuse that we as women so often keep quiet instead of coming out and saying what happened to us. And I spent the final night in that relationship fighting for my life against him when he decided that instead of allowing me to break up with him, he was going to end my life. And he began to strangle me. And at that moment, I truly felt like I was going to die. I felt like I could see the evil in his eyes, and I felt like he was not going to stop. And the only reason I fought back in that moment, it wasn't for myself. It was because out of anger, he had kicked my 6 pound Chiweenie dog I had named Rocky Balboa, my puppy, my baby that I loved so much. He kicked my dog, so I beat the holy shit out of him. I broke his nose, I cracked a couple of his ribs, and I started punching him as much as I possibly could before the cops showed up. And I realize now, looking back in those moments, that I probably would have killed him had the cops not shown up in that time. And when they did show up, they treated me as the aggressor and him as the victim. And so I was told I was going to go to jail for assault with a deadly weapon because I was a trained martial artist, while he would have the option to go to the hospital because they treated it as a domestic dispute. And once it became a domestic dispute, then it became, now we're going to take you both to jail until we investigate. And because he was more injured than I was, he was able to go to the hospital. I was going to be the one to go to jail. So I ultimately ended up not pressing charges against him, and he ended up not pressing charges against me. I left that night and I never went back. It took me several weeks to heal the bruises around my neck and my body, but the trauma, I didn't understand I was a victim at all. I looked at it as I was an equal. I was also somebody who was being a abuser, because that's what he had taught me to believe and he had really put into my head, and I truly believed it. And so I decided I was never going to get into a relationship like that again. So I rebuilt my life, right? I went to college, I got a job, I paid off all the debt that I had gotten into in that relationship. And that was where I met and married my now incredible husband, that is a true amazing man that I love and adore, and has really taught me what an actual healthy relationship looks like, with healthy boundaries and healthy communication, and what real, when somebody truly loves you, it actually feels like. And from there, we got married. I graduated college. We had a baby. From the outside looking in all intents and purposes, my life looked incredible. I had successfully left an abusive relationship, survived, and rebuilt. And it wasn't until I had my son at 29 years old that the trauma started to really replay, that all of those negative thoughts and beliefs that I had been told over the years through the different phases of trauma I had endured had really start to settle into the crevices of my mind. I developed severe postpartum depression after having my son, and it really felt like wave after wave of just imposter syndrome and feeling inferior. Like I wasn't a good mother, and I could never be a good wife and a good mother because I had failed so many times at accomplishing so many things I had wanted to accomplish. How was I supposed to be a good mom to this little baby that was dependent on me? And I ended up realizing after several months that I needed to get into some type of therapy. So it took me some time, but I found the right therapist and I got out of the postpartum depression. And as soon as I got out of the postpartum depression, we were headed into COVID. It was the end of 2019. And my mother was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. And I devolved into a hot mess of just pure anxiety, negativity. And again, that depression started to rear up, and I got diagnosed with severe depression. And it was in those really lonely moments while I was alone with a toddler trying to figure out how to make life work, while we were all locked down in COVID, and my mom was struggling, fighting for her life, doing chemo and radiation alone, 6 hours away from me, that I realized something in my life needed to change. And I looked in the mirror in that moment and I decided that my son was never going to see the weak woman I saw when I looked in the mirror. He was never going to see that version of me, and I didn't know what I was going to have to do to heal from it, but I knew that it was never going he wasn't going to grow up to see that. And sorry, I always get a little bit emotional when I talk about it. Um, and so that day, I decided that I was going to take control of my life in the only way that I truly could in that moment, and I was going to quit smoking. And so on December 3rd, 2020, I walked away as a non smoker, and I haven't smoked since. It's been going a little over 5 years now. And from there, I started to make really good, healthy decisions for my life. I stopped focusing on all the negative aspects. I stopped focusing on the toxic friends that I now call emotional vampires. And I started focusing on my family and my son and being a good wife and a good mother. And I really started to build the ideal version of myself, which is something now that I use as a worksheet in my actual courses. But I started to build what I wanted my son to see when he looked at his mother as he grew up. And I can happily say that I have successfully built that ideal version of myself 5 years later. And that was the beginning of Pretty Hands, Hard Punches. That was really where I started to realize that women need more than just physically understanding how to defend themselves. They need an overall concept of personal protection. They need to learn to have the confidence to walk away from that which is bad for them, from the red flags that lead to abuse before it ever gets physical. Because the moment that it gets physical, your life is in danger that very moment. And that was something as a trained martial artist, as a fighter, I didn't truly understand. I thought because I could fight, I would never be susceptible to abuse. And it wasn't until years later, through a lot of EMDR therapy with an incredible therapist named Amanda Harmon, who's amazing and saved my life, that I realized that I was so susceptible to this abuse because I thought and I had the arrogance that I would never be an abuse victim. And a lot of women think that'll never happen to me. I would never let that happen to me. And a lot of us, we can judge people outside of what's going on, but we are all susceptible at vulnerable times in our life to face different types of abuse. And it's not all just physical. And that's really where Pretty Hands, Hard Punches comes in, because I built the program to teach women how to recognize those dangers before it ever gets physical.
Whew. Let's take a moment and reflect because you the energy that you bring into everything that you do is beyond inspiring. You have one hell of a story that it's literally, God, I'm shaking. I can feel it in a good way because it's like, yes, I'm sitting on the edge of my seat just listening to you talk because it is. And if you don't give lectures, I swear you absolutely need to. You need to do this lecture series, like something. I don't know, but you said something, and I grabbed my notepad because you said emotional vampires. I'm living for that, and because it's true, because it feels like sometimes whenever you're around people, they just suck that energy straight out, and like it's like you could wake up in the morning, like you're energized, you're like go, you had a good night's sleep, which I don't know what the fuck that is, but anyway, but I don't know what the fuck it is anymore, but and I have it for many years, but a lot of it is like a trauma response, whenever I go to sleep, I have these flashbacks, I have these nightmares, I have like, and I kind of had them like, I believe in transparency, and you shared some very detailed things, and I appreciate that because it helps me paint how the rest of this conversation is going to go. But I also feel that you and I relate in a lot of different ways. And I grew up around an alcoholic stepfather, which was mentally, physically abusive at times, and especially mixing, different alcohols. And to this day, if I hear somebody like open like a pop can, it's an instant trigger. Um, I know what my triggers are, and even if it's like a pop can, even if it's not even like a beer can, if I hear it, it's just one of those like I kind of like freeze. It's like you have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. I
Yeah.
didn't realize what fawning was, but I experienced that during my own sexual assault. I didn't realize what that was. I knew about fight, fight or flight. I didn't know a lot about the freeze, and I also didn't know about the fawning part. And it wasn't until I went through my own therapy experiences of learning what fawning actually is. And my therapist looks right at me and she's like, "Did you experience this?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "This therapist is a badass." I was like, "You just discovered something that I've been trying to figure out for years and I just didn't know." I mean, if you go into Google and you type it in, it doesn't give you like a direct, like actual whole picture of what it is. That's like literally looking at WebMD for a sniffle. It's gonna tell you. Like, let's be real. People use WebMD. I mean, I know healthcare is extremely hard to access. Um, especially in like this society and like these Medicaid cuts and like, a whole lot of other stuff that's going on. But thinking about, pretty hands and hard punches, it's more than just a brand. There is a whole meaning behind it. It's a whole, pretty hands, hard punches. What does that mean to you and why? Why has this become a part of your branding? Because it means a lot and it catches
Oh yeah.
attention. And it's all pink.
So there's a huge story behind the Pretty Hands Hard Punches name. Part of it is just my martial arts background. Actually, almost all of it is. And part of it is kind of a fuck you to a lot of the guys who, said that girls shouldn't do martial arts. So, so Pretty Hands Hard Punches really comes from my childhood growing up in the martial arts industry. Often I was the only girl, and when I started doing tournaments, there wasn't a lot of guys around, or there wasn't a lot of girls to spar and fight. So often, I would do a tournament every week for 10 years. So there would be a lot where I would go in and there would be nobody in my division. And so I would have to fight the boys. And I got made fun of a lot when I was in right around middle school because that was the time where girls were starting to get feminine, where like puberty was starting, it was at the cusp and we were all 12, 13 years old. And I was very tomboyish and I played baseball and I did martial arts. And so I started painting my nails. That was my like femininity, right? I'm going to paint my nails pink. And my first instructor actually started to get angry with me. He said it was very distracting. And so I would end up having to do push ups before every class because I refused to take off the nail polish and he wanted me to. And so I always wanted to have at least have pretty hands when I was doing the martial arts because everything else on me was so aggressive and assertive and ambitious and goal oriented. And at the time, those weren't feminine traits that were talked about, right? They wanted us to be meek and quiet and pretty and soft. And I was none of those things. So I was like, I'm at least going to paint my nails. And to this day, I almost always have my nails painted. It's been an obsession for the last 30 years. Now, when I was under the Grandmaster's thumb and I was engaged to his son or dating his son, depending on which time in the relationship, when that bubble burst at the very end, right as I got fired and my whole life was falling apart, there was something that the Grandmaster said to me that I didn't know until he said the quiet part out loud. And he said that I was never going to be a head instructor. I was never going to be a school owner. I was 20 years old. I looked 15. And really the only reason a guy would train with me is because I was fuckable. He said my job was to look pretty and sell contracts, to submissively support my husband in the family goals. And when years later, as I started to develop Pretty Hands, Hard Punches, it actually came on the heels of Sarah Edmondson and Nippy Ames starting their A Little Bit Culty podcast. I had watched The Vow. I had become very obsessed understanding everything with cults because I couldn't quite understand why I was identifying with Sarah Edmondson. I was like, this woman was in a cult. Why am I identifying with her? And I realized later that I was also in a cult. That's why I was identifying. And there was one specific moment, and I was actually on her and Nippy's podcast in December. And I told her this story, and it was just one of those like full circle moments where I got to tell the woman who inspired Pretty Hands. And she had looked at the interviewer, and the interviewer said, like, if there's anything you could say to Keith Raniere, who was the Nexium cult leader, what would you say? And she had this very stubborn look. She looked directly into the camera and she would say, he messed with the wrong girl. And that moment, it was like 4 a.m. I was like, fuck it. I'm going to open Pretty Hands, Hard Punches. And although I didn't have the name, it came to me very quickly. Like, I'm going to do everything that they told me I wasn't allowed to do because I was a girl in martial arts as a young girl and woman. And so my brand is pink because the first time I ever wore a black and pink uniform to a tournament, I was given a 0 across the board and I was told that I was a disgrace to the art because I wore pink. By the grandmaster that was hosting the tournament. And so it became this very signifying logo and identifying mark that just is a huge middle finger to all of those men who used and abused me and tried to manipulate and coerce me into being what they wanted while simultaneously telling me if I am myself and I am who I want to be, I'm never going to be successful. And now that I have Pretty Hands Hard Punches and I do public speak and I do go out there and I do tell my story, it's really an empowering moment for me because every time I see my logo, which is essentially a martial artist bowing, the hand and the hand, the fist in the hand and the straight, that's the way that you bow to other martial artists. And so having the pink nails and having the Pretty Hands Hard Punches is just an overall like I'm going to be me and I'm going to do it successfully even though everyone in my life told me that I wouldn't succeed.
Been a long day. Um,
I gotcha.
but thank you for giving the backstory because I've been curious since the entire time. I was like, there's a reason behind this, and now it paints that whole picture. And on your website, um, prettyhandshardpunches.com, you have a part of it where it is 21 days to unbreakable. What is that? And why is it a part of what you do? Because building stronger boundaries, and this is directly from your website, but build stronger boundaries, sharper instincts, and real world confidence in 21 days. I love this because it's 3 weeks.
Yep.
3 weeks straight up. And thinking about this, this has a lot of like short video lessons in it. It has workbook, practice drill, community support. And I love this, first of all. And I think it needs to be expanded and everybody needs to be aware of this. Um, Especially whenever we think about our future generations growing up in rape culture. We see it on social media, we see it on websites. As of most recently, there has been, a quote unquote rape academy that has been exposed. Um, Millions of visitors or, millions of views on this website. Thinking about this, I feel like this is even more critical in today's society, thinking about what's on the headlines, thinking about like the politics behind it too, and also like the distinct cover up of survivor voices. And, I think about the Epstein survivors. I think about Harvey Weinstein. I think of, there's been several others that have been uncovered very recently, including former congressmen. And like, there's just a lot going on, right? And in today's society, I think this is even more important. But let's talk about 21 Days to Unbreakable and walk me through, building confidence and awareness and boundaries one day at a time. And this is, like I said, this is directly from your website. Let's talk about it. Let's have this discussion because it's even more relevant now than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I found as I began doing more podcasts and I began telling my story and publicly speaking was I would have a lot of people from around the world reaching out to me, asking me, do you have anything local to me? I only do local Southern California workshops and courses. And so now I'm starting to travel a little bit more, but especially in the beginning, it was very, a small business in a local area. And then I started to expand my voice and my public speaking doing. And so I developed 21 Days to Unbreakable to help women get started and get the confidence to find the right self-defense class if they want. So many women, by the time they realize they should do a self-defense class, they've already been assaulted. They already have some type of trauma. They've already been in an abusive relationship. They've already faced coercion and manipulation. And so often the self-defense classes are put on by men, the same men that look like who abused them. And so what I've found is I've had a lot of women reach out to me and ask for like a private lesson because they're not comfortable doing self-defense in a room full of people, even if it's just other women. And so I developed 21 Days to Unbreakable to go over the same curriculum I teach in my introduction course. How do you set boundaries? How do you understand what boundaries actually are? When is the right time to fight back? How do you know when the right time to fight back is? How do you find the resources if you're already in some type of abusive situation? And what I've found is that the people who have taken my course and who have done it it has empowered them to go find other like-minded self-defense classes in their area. And when as a woman, it's very difficult to go into a free or a paid for self-defense class and, have Chad the Muscle Man MMA fighter be like, here, I'm going to put my hands around your throat and then I'm going to teach you how to get out of it. For me, even as a martial artist, as a survivor of strangulation, it was incredibly difficult to let a man that I trusted and I knew do that as I was working through my curriculum in the early days of development. And so I only imagine that these women who have never done any type of martial art, they've never thrown a punch, they've never kicked or hit somebody, they've never fought back, how scary it must be to walk into a class with no knowledge of what you're going to learn and have some big muscly dude be like, I'm going to choke you and show you how to get out of it, or I'm going to grab you from behind and then I'm going to show you how to get out of it. I know for me, I was extremely triggered and I was in a safe place with a man I trusted. And so I developed 21 Days to really help women understand what true self-defense is, right? It's not just the physical reaction to an attack. And although I do have videos that they can learn from and they can practice at home in their own time, I also have trauma-informed understanding of here's what to do if you get triggered. Here's how to take a break. Here's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 reset of helping your body get calm again once you are triggered. Here's what to look for. Here's the red flags that we need to look for in abusive relationships. One of the things that we often are taught as young women is that it's going to be a stranger, right? It's going to be some creepy dude in a rape van outside the bar that's going to snatch you up. And sometimes that does happen. But the reality is it's going to be someone that you actually trust. It's going to be your boyfriend. It's going to be even your husband. It's going to be your friend that has always been amazing to you and offers to take you to drive you home after you drank a little too much. The reality is unless you can recognize those red flags and trust your gut and not dismiss it like we've all been taught, then you're always going to be at a point in danger with those around you. And so 21 Days into Unbreakable is really to give you that 3-week start on here's how to become unbreakable. Here's how to recognize those red flags. Here's how to have the confidence to walk away from something that is making you feel uncomfortable. And a lot of times as women, we're taught to be nice, to be polite, to nurture, to care for. And unfortunately, men use that, abusers use that to their advantage to victimize us all the time. They know you're going to be helpful. Ted Bundy used to pretend to be injured in order to collect his victims because he knew that women were going to try to help him. And so my thought is if I can get you to do a 21-day course, just 3 weeks, a couple of hours a day to really understand that introduction to women's self-defense, then it can empower you to learn more.
Because there's a lot to digest, there's a lot to process, and oftentimes a lot of people are looking for alternate methods of healing,
Yeah.
right? And this can absolutely be a part of that. I see that. Oftentimes healing is not a destination, or healing is a destination for different people, but it's also not necessarily as simple as, one, 1, 2, 3, everything's going to go away, right? It typically lasts for like years. And sometimes, unfortunately, some people don't see the other side of the situation. And I'm thinking about, Virginia Giuffre or Giuffre, rather. I think about that. We're coming up on the year anniversary of her date of death. And I think about again, I think about these Epstein survivors, and I know some of them have also went through self-defense, and they've had to learn, like
Yeah.
navigating this, especially in like the social media sphere. I feel that social media feels like it's good in a lot of aspects. I'm grateful for it because, it's led me to connect with people like you, but it's also opened the door to just predatory behavior from men and from, I know there's women predators too. I'm not going to deny that, but I understand it's not all men, but it's always a man, right? And
Yeah.
I say that as one, I say that as me, but I was taught to respect boundaries, to always ask for consent, even when you don't think you need consent. It's still good just to do it anyway, and just to get that consent and get that confirmation, even if you don't think it applies. It's still good just to have it. Um,
Yeah.
I was raised by a survivor. My mom was a domestic violence, sexual abuse survivor. I was raised, and my grandmother was as well. I come from a line of survivors, and then on my grandfather's side was a line of military. And then you mix both of those, and it creates a whole nother conflict and like a whole nother issue, right? Because oftentimes, sexual abuse in the military literally is, it's swept under the rug, and
Oh yeah.
it's not
All the time.
discussed, and it's not talked about. And I think about the case of Vanessa, and I think about her a lot, and I think about a lot of other survivors that I've gotten to know over the years. And which kind of brings me to my next talking point is, what does it feel like to you, from your perspective, on teaching others self defense? Like, what does that feel like to you, seeing people taking your course, or you're doing instructing, you're teaching people these methods of self defense? What does that feel like to you, and what you are teaching others now? You kind of see where I'm going with this, because
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
what does it feel like for you to teach others that to pre- to prevent this abuse from happening to them, and being able to defend yourself in these situations? What does that look like to you, and what does it feel like being able to empower other women?
Well, it's incredibly empowering, and it's it's a feeling of comfort and elation because I have always wanted to be a martial arts instructor from a very young age, right? When I realized I couldn't crawl through the sewers and eat pizza with the Ninja Turtles, I was like, oh, I can be a martial arts instructor and I can teach women or I can teach kids and people martial arts. And that would be, like I could be more like Spike, right? Or Splinter. Splinter. Is it Splinter? I don't know. It's one of those. Usually I don't talk about that part. But yeah, I realized I wanted to be a martial arts instructor at a very young age. And through the trauma I've gone through, I mean, me and my husband still have an idea to open a martial arts school at some point, probably in retirement, just because we see like the watered down kind of egotistical bullshit in a lot of the industry that we experienced. But I realized that I can still make a difference in people's lives and I can still teach parts of martial arts and I can do something that is going to help. And one of the things that really empowered me to develop the course was I had a specific set of skills that most women didn't. And originally, I thought Pretty Hands Hard Punches was pretty much just going to be me going to a bunch of women and being like, here's how you hit a dude in the throat, right? Here's how you just break his nose. And I didn't realize that self-defense is really more about avoiding the dangerous situation than it is about learning to fight off the danger. Because if you cannot be there, you're going to be way more safe than anything I can teach you how to do. I can teach you how to break noses and hit throats and, rip off ears and grab the Adam's apple and yank it and, possibly break the hyoid bone behind that and kill your assailant. But if you're not there, you're always going to be more safe. And so when I have these classes and I have, especially with young women, I'm never going to find justice for the things that happened to me. It happened too long ago where there wasn't language to explain that type of abuse. It was all pretty much just blame the victim for something they did to deserve it and move on. And so now I get empowered and excited to be able to teach women of all ages, but especially the young women, how not to fall for that manipulation tactic, how to walk away from the abusive boyfriend while he's still in the love bombing phase, before he gets to the isolation phase, how to recognize an abusive instructor before he grooms you and manipulates you into changing parts of your life for him or her, right? There's women and bad instructors and teachers and stuff too. But really, it's about, for me, it is more about empowering all of the women I come across. My ultimate goal is to empower 1 million women to learn women's self-defense. I believe that that is how we change the violence against women epidemic. I believe we fight back. And so often, as young women, we were taught not to fight back. Well, I was specifically told by men in my life to give him my body so he doesn't take my life if I ever find myself in that situation. And I completely am against that. I think that if a man is going to take your life, he's going to take it whether or not you fight back. That's his decision. You can only fight for your own life. And so I get that empowered feeling every time I watch a woman break a board at the end of my class, and because she never thought that she could hit hard enough to break through a board. I get empowered by watching women recognize how to set effective boundaries in their life so that they walk away from those emotional vampires. They walk away from that really toxic job. They walk away and feel empowered from my class to make better decisions for their life, to live a happy, healthy, and thriving life. And that's really what self-defense is more about. It's about recognizing abuse wherever it's at, recognizing red flags, and really setting the boundaries to tell the world how you're going to be treated.
Sorry, technical difficulties. Um, but I seem to have some technical difficulties on this show. I've come to realize that, but that's okay. It shows that I'm a human being and I make mistakes myself. But then they keep changing like the I don't know if anybody that's listening you use Zoom a lot, but I use Zoom like religiously and then I edit on Riverside. Both of these like super complex systems. So my brain goes in 40 million directions. I know we're coming up on time here in just a little bit. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, even though I feel like we could literally talk for literally hours on end. We could do a
I'm
whole
open, my
series.
friend.
Like, there's a lot that we can talk about, and there's going to be more conversations. But in a society, like ours, and we've talked about it during this episode a couple times, but self-defense is critical and it's crucial, especially in a time like now, growing up in rape culture, and generations are watching what's happening right now, and like the blatant cover-ups of survivor stories and survivors' voices. Thinking about that, um, how can people, one, support the work that you are doing? And then secondly, how can they continue to uplift your work, follow you on social media? And then I have one more question after this, but I want to get this part in there because this is a critical part because it'll help you expand what you are doing. Because I feel that what you are doing is deeply important, and I've been inspired. I can imagine what others will also take from this episode, but also just looking at your website, looking at the work you're doing, following you on social media. Um, but in a society, like I said just a few seconds ago, like what we're growing up in right now, self-defense is critical and crucial. And why is that? But this is kind of like a two-part question. So let's do this part first about why it's crucial and it's critical, and then we'll talk about how people can support the work that you are doing.
Absolutely. I realized that self-defense was critical when I was watching a lot of these cult shows and I was seeing how susceptible and vulnerable people are and how a lot of times women are the ones who are targeted. And then I started to do more research. One of the biggest things that inspired me to teach women self-defense specifically is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network statistic that I read several years ago. And that statistic says that 975 perpetrators out of every 1,000 sexual assaults will walk free. And I'll repeat that because some people usually get their eyes pretty big when I say it, but that's 975 perpetrators of sexual assault will walk free out of every 1,000 sexual assaults. And that's according to their surveys. And the way that that breaks down is out of the 1,000 sexual assaults, only 310 of those are going to be reported to police, which means 690 victims never even go into a police station and file a report. Out of those 310, the police are going to investigate to the point of an arrest about 50. And out of that 50, the prosecutors are going to decide to prosecute right around 28 to get a felony conviction. And three of those 28 are usually going to go into some type of mental institute. And then 25 of those people are going to be incarcerated. And when you look at a couple of other studies that are featured on the DOJ website, one of them states that an average teen boy who begins sexually assaulting as a teenager and goes untreated will treat on average or will assault on average 380 victims in his lifetime. So when you start feeling those numbers, you're like, oh, okay, 975 of these guys are going to walk free. And on average, if they started as a teen, there's 380 for each one of those. Now we're talking about thousands upon tens of thousands. And then the latest crime statistics from the DOJ website say, or the FBI website, I apologize, say that there are 84,765 rape incidences per 100,000 people in the United States. So we have an epidemic of rape against women, especially women, some men, some children, and we have a judicial system that does not follow through for survivors. The judicial system is there to hold perpetrators, to hold people accountable, but that's only if the police believe your story and the prosecutor believes that a jury of 12 is going to believe you. And if none of them believe you, your stuff isn't going to get justice. And you see that all of these women have so much evidence that they could be convicted, but we know as a society that we have been taught and indoctrinated to give the benefit of the doubt to the perpetrator and to blame the victim. That's why we ask the questions of what was she wearing? What was she doing? How much did she have to drink? Was she walking alone at night? Did she have a short skirt on? What was going on? Did she have sex with that guy before? Did she have sex with other people before? What is her sexual history? Because as a society, we look for ways to blame the victim before we will believe the victim and just hold the perpetrator accountable. It's much easier to blame the victim than hold the perpetrator accountable. And if we were to hold every person who does sexual assault accountable, our prison system would collapse. There's simply not enough cells to hold them. And that's why self-defense is so important, because at the end of the day, the police are not there to protect you. They're there to investigate a crime after it happened and possibly make an arrest. And the prosecutor is not there to find you justice. They're there to get a conviction if they believe they can. So nobody is really there to protect you. If you have a husband, sure, he could protect you if he's there in that moment. If you call the police, maybe they'll get there in time. But at the end of the day, and the reality is, you have a split decision to make a decision on how to a split second to make a decision to how to save your life. And you can't rely on anybody else. You have to rely on yourself. And that's why I teach situational awareness. I teach language, tone, posture. I teach how to run away and escape. I teach basic moves to get out of a situation. And then I teach what to do if something happens to you. The time to learn how to handle the trauma of a sexual assault is not after you get sexually assaulted and you're in shock and you're traumatized. It's before understanding the criminal judicial system. And right now, I actually just this year re-enrolled to go get a dual bachelor's degree in criminology and psychology so that I can understand the criminal defense or the criminal justice system from the inside. I've also been talking with local police stations. I'm going to be doing ride-alongs. I really want to understand the processes and procedures our police force use in order to help victims. And right now, we don't understand that. We don't really know as a society what their processes and procedures are. And so I decided to go back and get a bachelor's and then ultimately a master's degree in criminology and psychology so I can better advocate for victims. Because we need people who know what to say to the police officers, who know what to do. And if you don't know, I can guarantee you that your abuser, the man who raped and assaulted you, the man who hurt you, he does know because abusers practice their skills. They know what to say to the police. They know how to divert. They know how to make you look crazy. They've been abusers before. They've had victims before, and they have learned. And I always use for women the same analogy. I always say, the first time we ever put on eyeliner, we looked like a raccoon. But the 50th time we put on eyeliner, it looked really pretty and we looked like a pro. Well, abusers, the first time they did it, they probably did it sloppy, but you're probably not their first victim. You're probably their 50th. So they know what to do. They know exactly what to say, and they know how to work the judicial system so that they're not held accountable.
That's a mic drop moment, first of all, because you just went on a whole tangent here for this. These are the tangents that I love because it's not even a tangent. It's just speaking the absolute truth and the reality of the society in which we live. And now the second part of that question is how can people uplift and support the work that you are doing, and how can they follow you on social media?
I'm really trying to build my social media presence in a very organic way with people that can benefit from my reels and the information I give. So if you could follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, everything's at Pretty Hands Hard Punches. Thankfully, I have a very unique name. That would be incredible. I'm really trying to boost those numbers this year so that I can reach as many people as possible. I found that reaching 1 million women is more difficult than just being able to do some local classes. So, amplifying my voice, my YouTube channel, my videos, sharing them with somebody that they could find beneficial, that they could use the information to help them stay safe was the best way to really support me and my mission to empower 1 million women.
Absolutely. And, in the description of this episode is the website and your social media handle because we want to obviously direct as many people to you as possible and make sure that people understand why this is critically important. And I also think we need to do a follow-up episode. Obviously, I know you're down for it anytime. I understand that. But I think we need to do like a more in-depth conversation around survivor voices and around survivors. And um, I wanted this to be an introduction, conversation to the work that you do. And then after you do some of these ride-alongs, after you do, some of that, I invite you to reach back out because I'm curious to know what you've observed, and also whenever you're doing that, take notes, like even on like your phone, it's like take notes and like so we can kind of like, obviously it's going to look different in California than it would in Kansas and Missouri, but I'm actually curious, and I'm curious to do a follow up because I'm after you do some of these ride alongs with these departments, it's going to look different in each department, and you're going to see inconsistencies. You're going to see, oh, this might work here, or maybe we should do this a little bit different. But I like that you're doing that because it gives that whole another perspective to it from the inside, and then you can share like, okay, this is what we need to be advocating for. Who can I contact? Can I contact my congressperson? Can I contact my state legislature or legislator to get some of these changes going? Because there's a lot that you can do on the local level too.
Yeah,
There's just a lot that
absolutely.
can happen. But again, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been an absolute eye-opening moment for me. Um, we'll continue uplifting the work that you are doing. Continue, you have an open invite to collaborate with us on social media at any time. That goes to anybody who's out there listening. If you have a story, if you have something you want shared and amplified, we have a platform that we're willing to use to amplify the voices that the mainstream media and corporate media they push to the side. And it happens far too often.
Yeah.
Um, but other than that, please take care of yourself and I'll see you on the socials.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited. We finally got to do this.
Yes, absolutely. It's been very eye-opening and there's a lot of important information. So we will amplify. And with that, thank you so much.